Well, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might be. Welcome to the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara. I'm Joe Miller. It is our pleasure this afternoon to present to you Dr. Barry Bittman, who will speak to us on the scientific foundations of creative musical expression. The Institute of World Culture bases their programs on the 10 aims of the Institute, which were adopted in 1976. And I think our presentation today falls nicely on proposition number 6, to promote forums for fearless inquiry and constructive dialogue concerning the frontiers of science, the therapeutics of self-transformation, and the societies of the future. For those of you in the hall, I might just remind you the restrooms are through that passageway to your right and turn left. We will hear a presentation from Dr. Bittman, and then we will take up questions. The allotted time for this program is from 2 to 4 today. And very good. Let me give a little introduction. Dr. Bittman is a neurologist, researcher, international speaker, and author who serves as Chief Population Health Officer for the Inland Empire Foundation for Medical Care. And today he heralds to us from South Carolina, his home. He is also the CEO of the Yamaha Music and Wellness Institute, a nonprofit organization that is actively engaged in education and research. And he serves as a national healthcare transformation consultant. He's an expert on laughter and the immune system. He is a big believer in drum circles. And he also feels that each of us should devote a portion of our day to enabling the sounds of resilience to emerge from us. And so it's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Bittman.
Thank you. And can you see my presentation?
We can.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you both for inviting me to present today. I'd also like to thank Drew Tredick, who basically turned me on to your organization. And I want you to know I've been looking forward to this for the last few months. A little bit more background on me. I graduated from medical school in 1977, became a neurologist, started practice in '83, and quickly realized that in healthcare we didn't have all the answers. Frankly, that was disappointing at the time. And while I was basically a healthcare administrator for a community hospital, I felt that we had to engage patients in the active pursuit in health and wellness and really give them a critical position on the healthcare team where they could take an active and meaningful role in their own health. And at that time, we typically amalgamated multiple strategies, which included our typical or traditional medical care with nutrition, exercise, and stress reduction strategies. We certainly didn't have any problem at all with the standard medical treatments. Some of the top selling books in the country were on nutrition. And frankly, there was no shortage of material on exercise as well, as is today. However, when it came to stress reduction, we sort of hit a wall. I started out in Western Pennsylvania, which was sort of middle America. And we felt that to treat patients appropriately, we really had to integrate stress reduction strategies. However, most people in that community, in that era, were not open to strategies like yoga or Tai Chi or the kinds of things that you would typically see on both coasts. Frankly, I had no real sense of how we were going to deal with that issue until a lecture that I performed in Florida for multiple physicians, nurses, and counselors. I did one of the keynotes on laughter and the immune system. And frankly, right after the presentation, a music therapist came up to me and said, Dr. Bittman, are you going to the drum circle this evening? And I said, drum what? And she said, drum circle. I said to her, I hate to tell you, but I really don't know what a drum circle is. She said, if you're here, I said, I'm not leaving till tomorrow morning. She said, why don't you come and be our guest? Well, anyway, I showed up and there were, believe it or not, 3,000 health professionals drumming in one of these double hotel auditoriums. And frankly, I had never heard music that loud. And frankly, I was in awe because as a healthcare administrator, I never saw 3,000 physicians ever doing anything together. So I was profoundly moved. But I want to be very frank with you. I took that experience back and didn't do much with it. And then about 6 months later, we were offering a state-certified program for patients with chronic obstructive lung disease. And I was having difficulty again finding a stress reduction strategy. I don't shop often, but I did that weekend. And we walked into a mall and I saw these very colorful Remo hand drums. And I basically bought a couple of dozen of them. I brought them back to the pulmonary rehab program where patients and their loved ones would sit in a circle and discuss the challenges that they were experiencing. I put the drums in the center of the circle and did absolutely nothing. Within minutes, the patients started picking up the drums. And frankly, it was like the Lay's potato chip ad. They couldn't just have one. In fact, they couldn't stop. In fact, one of the most cantankerous patients we had sort of took the lead, and everybody drummed for an hour. And I sort of observed. The oxygen masks were falling from their faces. They were having fun. They were breathing. They were enjoying the activity. And I said to myself, this is really outstanding. I had never seen anything like it. And I said, I think we have a seminal moment here, because this is really showing me that even for a challenging group like this, there's a willingness to participate in what we later termed recreational music making, with the term recreatio, the Latin root, basically meaning restoration to health. And this was contrasted against a typical music performance where the goal was to get to Carnegie Hall or to play in competition. Make a long story short, I had promised the institution that we would never do anything that wasn't evidence-based. And frankly, I sent my research team out in all directions, and I asked them to bring back all of the credible research that they could find on the value of playing a musical instrument. And 3 weeks later, I sat in the conference room with the team, and they basically had nothing. There were a few studies that were published that were poorly done. They wouldn't really pass scientific muster, and I was sort of stuck because I had made this commitment. So I decided at that time that since this seemed so beneficial for this group, and by the way, one of the TV channels came in and did a show on what we were doing, that we would proceed with research. And frankly, I had no idea that that would open up decades of research, which would progressively help us better understand the phenomenon. To make a very long story short, we began at that point essentially with the idea of being able to move forward and progressively, okay, understand the ancient thinking of how the physician and musician were one and the same. And I want you to know, and you're going to see this theme throughout this presentation this afternoon, that I consider myself the world's leading expert on what doesn't work. And you'll see that through multiple research studies where we had insights, we had some direction, but it didn't sort of play out the way we had hoped it would. So I'm going to take you through that journey, give you a sense of sort of what we learned in the last couple of decades, and also give you an opportunity at the end to answer questions. A little bit more about myself. My background is I'm a classically trained pianist, which essentially means I stopped as a teenager, stopped playing, and regained a sense of wanting to make music once I finished medical school. Back one of our first purchases. What we're really focused on, and I'm going to show this at the end, is what I term pillars of transformation. And these are key insights that are derived from all of these studies and more, which has basically given me a sense that humans are hardwired toward music. I'm also going to show you how the evolution of technology really changed the way we actually looked at research and what we could actually prove or study. And this was sort of an interesting era, and you'll see some of the limitations that we considered in our first investigation. If at any time any of the leaders wish to stop me and ask a question, please don't hesitate. Bottom line is, despite the fact that we found ancient flutes that are over 50,000 years old, frankly, we didn't have much of a clue on how music actually worked. In fact, there is not a great body of research, even today, that focuses in this area. The disappointment that I've had over the decades of research is I thought that our research would actually spurn the interest of the scientific community in looking at this type of challenging work. And I was hoping that there would be an abundance of published studies, peer-reviewed published studies today. However, that's really still not the case. So we continue to learn, and I often refer to this as being in the embryonic stage of understanding. We basically asked a very, very simple question. How does playing a musical instrument affect our biology? Now, I'm going to regress for 1 second because, as you had mentioned, I had an interest in laughter and the immune system. And I participated with leading researchers at Loma Linda University School of Medicine to uncover some of the mechanisms through which laughter improved our biology. And we had done that research, it had been published, it had been featured in many different areas. And one of our colleagues said, you know, this is pretty fascinating. I wonder how it would work with music. So we basically took our collective experience at that time and we said to ourselves, sure, why don't we give it a shot? So I'll never forget, through a friend of a friend, I was able to get in touch with a little Italian gentleman in California. His name was Remo Belli, probably the best known person in drumming in the world. And basically got him on the phone, told him what we wanted to do. He was familiar with our peer-reviewed published research. And when I named a figure for what it would cost to do the research, he immediately said yes. That was the easiest funding I've ever had in my life. And what basically happened after that first study is Remo invited me to an international meeting. I presented our research and findings. I flew back to California, and he said to me, Barry, what do you want to do with this? And I said, frankly, sometimes you do great research, but it winds up collecting dust, in a cabinet. Why don't we go ahead and see if we can develop a strategy for training health professionals and others in how this actually works? And we did. And over the course of the next decade, we trained over 35,000 facilitators, mostly people in the medical arena, but also teachers, counselors, other individuals who have used these strategies in a variety of settings, medical and other. And the program lives on today as Health Rhythms. So what's kind of interesting about what I'm going to talk about is we didn't start with an idea for a program. We started with a research challenge. And from that research challenge, we figured out, as I mentioned before, what absolutely did not work. And then we sort of got the formula right. So I'm going to share this with you. The field that I was in at that time is called psychoneuroimmunology. And that's the relationship between what we think and what we feel, and the nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system. And of course, I represented the nervous system part of this as a research-based neuroscientist. So, what we had to do at that time, based upon the language that was available in the scientific community, is to determine whether or not active participation in music was a eustress or a stress paradigm. Everybody knows what stress is. Eustress was absolutely the opposite. So if you could look at the biological changes, the negative modulation that would happen in our systems with stress, eustress was a term that was coined to look at the very opposite. And we started on that premise with the idea that we would take a shot at trying to figure this out. The very first study was a rather interesting one. We basically recruited 111 normal subjects. What do I mean by normal? I mean people that were pretty much disease-free. They didn't have a history of heart or lung disease, hearing loss. They weren't pregnant. They hadn't missed a menstrual period. And these were individuals who also were not on medications or who used drugs, and certainly who didn't consume more than a couple of alcoholic drinks per day. That was the basis for the exclusionary criteria, or simply stated, for the people that we sort of eliminated. The concept was that we would set up drum circles the same time of the day, the same day of the week, same facilitator, in exactly the same setting, and we would draw blood before and after the circle to see if there was any change, which we refer to as modulation, in immune parameters as the patients drummed. Well, subjects, I should say. They weren't patients. To make a long story short, our control group was a group of individuals who were randomly assigned, who basically sat in exactly the same room under the same conditions, the same exclusionary criteria, and they listened to drumming music. So the control group listened, the actual study group actually drummed. And we also eliminated people who considered themselves musical. So we didn't want people who had a lot of experience making music in the past. We basically worked with the University of Iowa School of Medicine, a group that looked at all of the samples for us. And essentially, we measured substances in the blood that basically reflected the state of the immune function for the human body. To make a very long story short, we conducted the control group first, then we conducted conducted our first actual drumming group, and it took us about 2 weeks to get the results back. And when we looked at it, what do you think we found?
No difference.
Absolutely nothing. There were no statistically significant groups or differences between the group that actually listened to music versus the group that created music. And I said to myself, there's something not right here. So we decided to try it again. And this time I went to the drum circle facilitator. And I basically said to him, I said, let's try something a little bit different. Instead of talking as much and giving directions to the group, why don't we actually drum more during that hour session? And he was a wonderful gentleman. He said, absolutely, let's do it. So we actually drummed more during the second session. And what do you think we found? Not only did things not get better, they actually got worse. And we said to ourselves that we had probably exceeded the exercise threshold for the cohort or for the group that we were studying. And when you do that, you actually diminish immune function. So that was a robust failure. The third group, I said, maybe, we're not approaching this from the right perspective. Maybe we have to do this from a more cultural or humanistic perspective. So believe it or not, we actually had a Mayan drummer in the community. And he was absolutely fabulous, an incredible gentleman. He conducted the third session, and we sent the samples off to the University of Iowa School of Medicine. We got them back, and you probably won't be surprised at this point, but we failed miserably. We found absolutely nothing. There were no statistically significant differences for the control group versus the experimental group. And frankly, we were perplexed. And it took a little while, actually about 2 weeks, to try to figure out what to do next, because we're burning a lot of money and we're not producing any results. And yet, I can tell you personally, I felt different after each one of these sessions. So something had to change biologically. What we actually surmised at that point, after talking to a lot of the subjects, is that while we approach this with a great deal of positive anticipation, very few people in America actually consider themselves musical. Many people were told to sing Far, Far Away, or they didn't make it past the junior high school band. And they lived with the impression that they were not musical. So people sat there during the session saying to themselves, God, I hope they don't call on me. So what we actually did is we were producing anxiety or a stress response by what we were doing. So at that point, decided to look at this from an entirely different perspective. I went back to the laughter research. And to be very frank, I said to myself, what we have to do is get everybody absolutely comfortable from the start, get them laughing, get them having fun, then let them actually participate in music making and do it in an absolutely non-threatening way. So we came up with a 10-step program that began with some relaxation, some laughter, some basic participation. But the idea was we eased the group into it. And lo and behold, on that fourth try, it actually worked. And we finally found something that modulated biology in the right direction. To be very frank, no good scientist stops with one positive trial. So we replicated that trial 4 more times. We went to publication, and this is the actual study, composite effects of group drumming, music therapy on modulation of neuroendocrine immune parameters in normal subjects. And what that essentially means in a nutshell is we were finally able to produce some positive biological changes. So let me show you in a very simplistic way what we actually were able to discover. What you're looking at over here is directly from the paper. The two charts focus on natural killer cells on the left, which are specialized white blood cells that seek out and destroy cancer cells and virally infected cells. And the second group, I'm sorry, let me get back to this. Sorry. The second group on the right looked at what we call interleukins and gamma interferon, which, pardon the pun, are modulators of immune function. And as you can see, the yellow bars represent what we call the treatment group or the study group, and the blue bars represent the controls. And as you can see, there was positive modulation at different dilutions for these natural killer cells in the group that actually drummed compared to the control group. And when you look at interleukins and interferon gamma, which are immune substances that are often used, for example, in cancer treatment, you can see that the natural production of these substances based on different ratios actually upmodulated substantially. These are all statistically significant findings versus the control group where there was basically no modulation at all. So this is what I consider to be the first scientific study that rigidly looked at the impact of people actually making music, creating music. And this paper sort of kicked this field off because the press got a hold of it and it wound up, on the full page, the first page of USA Today in the second section, which really generated a tremendous interest in whether or not we could really document for the very first time whether or not playing a musical instrument had positive health effects. And that was a great study. There were some people that came out and said, we found a treatment for cancer. And I call that psychoneuromythology because we didn't study any patients with cancer and we didn't look at the impact of anyone with cancer, but these were cancer-fighting cells, natural killer cells that we're very familiar with even today. So I want you to know that we found a correlation, and this is very important. The correlation was the association of playing the drums in a drum circle with these biological findings. Unfortunately, some people out in the field started, I hate to use this term, but we use it in AI today. They actually started confabulating and stating that we found mechanisms. And even today, when I lecture in the medical field around the country, or sometimes around the world, people say to me, weren't you the guy that showed that playing the drums improved endorphin production? And I want to make this absolutely clear. We did not look at endorphins, and endorphins typically rise with strenuous activity. So that was not the focus of the study. So we learned a lot here. We learned that from a research perspective, not only testing music, but we were making sure that we fully understand people's perceptions before they actually came into the study. Because a negative outcome anticipation from a subject can move the entire study in a very negative way. And I'll take questions about this later. This later became known as Health Rhythms. And this is the program that we now have in 26 countries of the world. So this is being used in multiple settings with the idea of bringing together people with all sorts of challenges to help them express themselves. And the most fun part of this entire protocol, I use the term protocol to basically describe a reproducible series of steps, is that once the group is really gelled, we ask people to say something on the drum that they couldn't normally just saying words. And we found that many people could not express themselves verbally, but when they had the opportunity to bang on something, they could really express their feelings. And we refer to this in the context of what's known as disclosure theory from a well-known researcher by the name of Jamie Pennybaker. So anyway, that's health rhythms, and it, believe it or not, it's still being taught today. Bottom line is, as a researcher, you have to step back and say to yourself, what do we really have here? What does this really mean? Have we cracked the egg? And my answer was, not quite yet. So just because we can measure biological modulation or change doesn't mean that it has any real societal benefit. So the question for us next was, is doing this, in doing it, are we producing any real life impact? Are we changing quality of life for anyone? So we decided to try to find a real stressed group. And this study, which was published in 2003, the first one was 2001, looked at the most stressed out group that I could find in healthcare, which were long-term care workers. And back at that time in 2003, there were all sorts of challenges based upon the fact that long-term care facilities and nursing homes couldn't keep their employees. Turnover was absolutely off the wall, and elder abuse was sort of rising to the surface because the workers were burnt out and they weren't treating people really well. So we found a facility. By the way, all of these studies are peer-reviewed, IRB-approved studies. So we've always taken the necessary steps. But we looked at 112 employees, and we didn't look at them in a single session, but we looked at them over 6 weeks, one session a week for 6 weeks. This time, we added a little bit of keyboard accompaniment to sort of liven it up a bit. And we focused on burnout and mood dimensions to see if we could change it. We also decided that we wanted to see if this had any real world impact, and if we could predict retention of employees and potential cost savings in doing so. So what we did is we set forth to basically design what's called a crossover design study. And this is actually really simple. In the first 6 weeks, Group A does the intervention, while Group B just carries on their normal activities. In weeks 7 through 12, Group A that did the intervention in the first part doesn't. They don't do anything other than their normal activities, while Group B does. So that's where things cross over. And of course, we did multiple sets of this to get to 112 participants. So again, in the first part of the study, Group A is doing it, Group B is not. The second part of the study, Group B is doing it, and Group A is not. And I wanted to show you something over here because I think this is really important. And believe it or not, we use these measures today, even 20 years later. The Maslow burnout inventory characterizes burnout in 3 terms: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. And you can see when we look at the differences between the 2 groups that we were able to reduce emotional exhaustion and depersonalization. Those are these numbers here. And we were able to also boost personal accomplishment. However, when we added in the profile of mood states and looked at tension and anxiety, depression and dejection, anger and hostility, vigor and activity, fatigue and inertia, confusion and bewilderment, and formulated all of those together, we aggregated them. We used the term total mood disturbance, and you can see this bottom right notation is we were able to reduce it by 46%. That's at 6 weeks. So the group that participated obviously had very substantial outcome compared to the group that didn't. But the question for us at that point is, that's really nice because we just completed the experiment, but is there a persistent effect? What do I mean by that? Does the effect actually extend beyond the experiment? This is actually pretty easy to measure because group A is drumming during the first 6 weeks and group B is not. But group A is doing nothing in the second 6 weeks. So what we did is we wanted to see if the impact was long lasting. And we went ahead and we repeated this 6 weeks later after group A had completed what how they had participated. And as you can see, there were even larger or more impactful changes in the Maslach burnout inventory. And we went from minus 46% to minus 62% in total mood disturbance. So the question is, why did the group actually do better 6 weeks after the conclusion of the experiment? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, we gave them homework during those drumming sessions. So the insights that were shared during those sessions were put into play in their workplace. And the second was, people got to know each other on a much more personal level by drumming together. So there was a tremendous sense of mutual support. And it was rather interesting. I'm going to share one session for you. And each group had 10 to 12 people. A facilitator was managing this group. I was not. And there was a gentleman in the group who was actually disruptive. He was a maintenance person who basically was a pretty sour guy. He had reported the facility on 4 episodes. He was uncooperative. He wasn't very nice. And while in the first 3 sessions, he was actually hitting on a nursing assistant. And the facilitator just finally got to a point. She was a delightful human being, but she essentially said, we don't seem to be doing anything right for you. How can we help you? And he exploded. He basically said, this is the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. He said, while you guys are drumming like a bunch of idiots, he said, I want you to know that my brother died of leukemia. And now my son has it, and he's dying. And the whole group stopped because he had never mentioned anything like this before. The interesting thing is, in developing the protocol for training facilitators, we make sure that the facilitator does not respond in situations like that, because if they do, they cut off the group. And the facilitator did nothing. Within 20 seconds, everybody in the group got up and gave this guy a hug. Absolutely hugged this gentleman. It was one of those unforgettable moments. To be very frank, at that stage, we didn't really know what was going to happen. But it became very apparent that this actually changed the man. And within a matter of days, he showed up early, he stayed late, he helped everybody he possibly could, and he became the principal evangelist for group drumming during the session. Now, I'm not going to point him out. You'll see a picture where he's included later. But he was the person who was drumming most vigorously when I did the CNN headline news interview about the research study. So that transformation in the human being occurred at a moment that we all witnessed during that session. And that also changed my conception of what was happening, because it really struck a very deep note that perhaps music was an extraordinary communications tool that could move us past what was too painful to put into words. So that was a very successful study. Now, fortuitously, and sometimes you're in the right place at the right time, I wanted to go further with our biological studies. But to be absolutely frank with you, I wasn't sure what we were doing. And you're probably saying to yourself, oh, this is a researcher that's spending lots of money doing this stuff. Well, the questions that I had are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring? Are our tests sensitive to pick up everything we need to pick up? Are we able to look at what's happening in the moment? Are we looking at delayed effects? Timing is a huge issue in research, and we didn't know. And at that point, I felt a high degree of frustration in looking at biology this way. And then suddenly a breakthrough came to the rescue. And that breakthrough was the sequencing of the human genome in 2001. For the very first time, we could actually look at what we call genomic expression, meaning that we could sample blood and immediately look at the single molecule level and look at exactly what proteins were being structured based upon what we call immune or neuroimmune modulation. So essentially what it basically means is that your DNA strand is a double helix. The sense of exhilaration, anger, frustration, just about any emotion triggers a biological response. That biological response actually triggers a cascade. That cascade is multiple biological changes that occur in the body. And when you look at all of that put together, you might see a rise in blood pressure. But the bottom line is we could actually measure the initial step. And to me, that was perhaps the most exciting moment of my life, because I realized that we could now take a snapshot that was accurate. So we decided that we were going to do this experiment looking at our representative genes in the stress response. And we contacted a group in San Francisco, a group that basically beat the World Consortium to deciphering the human genome, sequencing it. And they partnered with me on the study so that we could determine whether or not, for the very first time, this type of experiment was possible, looking at actual gene expression. The problem I had at that point was, I guess I had been overthinking the challenges and the thoughts that came into this from other people. And I finally realized I couldn't find a control group that was not stressed. Even if people told me that they weren't stressed, there was no way to really guarantee it. I mean, you could have a problem with your spouse the night before, you could be concerned about your income tax, you could have a problem at work, and you're not necessarily going to share that with a researcher. So I figured I had to level the playing field. So what I essentially did was this, created a two-part experiment where the first part was stress induction. The second part was stress reduction or amelioration. So how did we induce stress? Well, based upon human subjects, research, and IRB regulations, we certainly weren't going to hurt the person. We weren't going to shock the person. But what we did is we found a group of people that agreed to participate in the experiment. We started IVs in each of them so we could sample blood. We put them in a room with 4x8 tables, and we literally gave them the puzzles from hell. These were 1,000-piece puzzles, but we made it even worse. There were missing pieces, there were extra pieces, and there were no straight corners. And we were, our team was telling the subjects that the person who put the most pieces together in that hour would get an extra $100. They were paid $50 for participating in the study. Well, I want you to know that during that first half of the study, after drawing baseline blood work and looking at some stress surveys, the people were fidgeting with the puzzles. They were having a great deal of trouble. And to make matters worse, our team at different points during that hour would make noise, drop things on the floor, do anything they could to increase tension without hurting the people, and walk up to different individuals and sort of whisper in their ear, "You're doing okay, but everybody else is doing better." So we stressed the heck out of these people. And we essentially verified that by surveys that each one of them completed when we did the post-blood work. The second phase of the study, the subjects were broken into 3 groups. The first group got to sit back, read newspapers and magazines, just put their feet up and relax. The second group got to participate in a recreational music-making activity, this time using clavinovas or electronic pianos, using a very similar protocol that we had developed for the keyboard. And the third group, the unfortunate group, unfortunately had to continue with the puzzle activity for another hour. So we clearly induced stress in phase 1. In phase 2, we had 3 different parts of the study to see if we were able to reduce it. Well, I couldn't wait to get the results. They were processed in San Francisco. It took, I think, about 10 days to get the results back. And we knew that we had induced stress. What do you think we found when we saw the results? I won't keep you in suspension. We found absolutely nothing.
Oh.
There was absolutely no biological change of any clinical significance across the group. And I said to myself, oh, we've blown another experiment here. This doesn't make a great deal of sense. We know these people were stressed out. I mean, some people were actually breaking puzzle pieces to try to shove them into slots. And it was the 3rd sleepless night that I had, where I woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning and I said to myself, I think I understand what happened. There's a researcher in the 50s, you guys, based upon your backgrounds, probably have heard of this gentleman, Hans Selye.
Yeah.
He's considered the father of stress. They didn't have any technology that could measure any of this back then. But he said stress is a non-specific response to any demand. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm playing this back through my mind, and I'm saying, what the heck did he mean? And then I said to myself, now that we have genes, maybe each person responds uniquely to each stimulus. Maybe there is no finding that could easily be uncovered to look at a group, but we have to look at the individual. And by the way, that was the error where we defined individualized medicine. So what I did is I woke up the statistician at Lomland at that point and basically said to him, what I want you to do is I want you to put together profiles for each person and let's see what happened to their individual profiles. And I termed this gene expression signatures, which were combinations of genes that upmodulated, meaning got turned on or got turned off. And what was really interesting over here, and you can see the 2 phases, the puzzle phase and then phase 2, A, B, and C, is that for the first time, looking at phase 1, we could see specific patterns of activity in individuals. So this is kind of what it looked like. If you look at this, these were the genes that we were measuring, which were all parts of the stress axis. And as you can see, in the top group, most of the genes got turned on. In the second group, most of the genes got turned off. And in the third group, some genes got turned on and some genes got turned off. So we had 3 different patterns of activity. And what we did is we individualized our analysis to look at these individuals. And I said to our statistician, let's look at each person and see whether there was a change from stress to relaxation with music. And this is what we were able to find. In subjects who performed the recreational music making activity following the 1-hour stress protocol, 19 of the 45 markers reversed themselves, meaning anything that was up modulated now turned off. Anything that was down modulated turned on. And I know this is complicated on the right, but these are the genes that we looked at. And what was interesting is there were only 6 out of 45 markers that changed, okay, in the resting control group. That's the group that sort of leaned back, put their feet up, and read newspapers and magazines. And not surprisingly, when we continued to stress them, this is a very unfortunate group that had to continue the puzzle for another hour. There were no reversals in gene expression. So this was a major step in music and biological research. It was actually the first paper looking at gene expression in the context of inducing or reversing stress. In fact, this won one of the Scientific Papers of the Year award. Bottom line for us is we felt, without a shadow of a doubt, that that was an important study. But as you can imagine, it sort of wet our whistles, and we decided that we wanted to go further. So we were able to partner up with the United States Department of Defense, the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, their prior chief of cardiology, and a team for one of the genomic institutes for the federal government. And we decided to basically try to replicate the study, but this time, rather than looking at 46 genes, we decided to take on the entire human genome, roughly 17,000 genes. And we decided to do it in a group of individuals who had a history of what we call ischemic cardiovascular disease. So in order to get into the study, they had to have a history of a myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, angina, a coronary artery bypass or stent, or documented ischemia, meaning diminished blood flow, based upon cardiac cath data, meaning you put a wire in a tube inside the heart and measure blood flow and pressures and so on. We did this in a very carefully controlled manner. It was funded by the federal government, and we basically looked at the entire gene set. We spent 4 months looking at the first series of data that we came up with. And true to form, as I told you, I'm the world's leading expert on what doesn't work. We found absolutely nothing. Now, I want you to know this is pretty tough because what you're looking at in its most simplistic form, and remember, this was really before AI, is 17,000 variables to the 17,000th power. So we found it. So we basically brought in another statistician. We looked at all the data, went through the entire thing, spent a year at it, and lo and behold, after all of that work, we again found absolutely nothing. And then, after this is a year and a half of doing analytics, we found a third group of statisticians. And the question was, rather than looking at individual genes, could we look at genomic or metabolic pathways? Meaning, the example I gave you before about raising blood pressure, there are lots of steps before the blood pressure actually rises. Could we look at every single gene that's coordinated with that particular step? And we brought in another research team, put that into play, and basically what we were able to do for the very first time is show through a heat map, that's what you're looking at on the right, with genes, you can see the shift in color from controlled intervention groups. We only had one group here, and that was the group that basically did the music making activity after stress induction. So we actually found it. It took us 1.5 years before the solution surfaced, but we actually found that the music activity had a profound effect. And we found 16 molecular pathways that were what we call differentially regulated, meaning that these were specifically impacted by that activity. Again, statistically significant to the p of 0.005, 5,000 chance of happening without randomization. And what we were able to do is characterize what those actual changes were in these pathways in the human body in patients with coronary vascular disease. And I guess I didn't include it because it's extraordinarily complex, but we were able to elucidate the actual changes that occurred in those pathways that regulated many functions in the human body, not surprisingly of which was also breast cancer. So we looked at the pattern of gene activity that was involved in the cascade, meaning all the steps, and by collecting those genes and putting them together, we were able to differentiate clearly the impact of playing the musical instrument versus not playing the instrument. So that was a major awakening for us because we reached a point where the analytics became so complicated and so burdensome. I wish we would have had AI back in that era. We didn't. But we stumbled upon this, saying to ourselves that we shouldn't look at individual genes, we should actually look at pathways, and it worked out. Next, we decided to take a look at at-risk youth. These are kids that were typically what we call dually diagnosed, meaning they had behavioral problems and they had mental health problems. These were kids from Philadelphia. These were rough and tough kids who were considered delinquents. And I'm not using that in a pejorative manner, but the term referred to kids that would have been incarcerated had it not been for their age. And we basically set up a 6-week program. We did a crossover design. You can see the group was really challenged. I mean, we had oppositional defiance disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, separation anxiety, mood disorders, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, ADHD. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Of the 52 kids, 23 reported past sexual abuse, neglect. There was a very high incidence of school truancy. And as a result, these kids, rather than being placed in jail, were sent to a children's home in our community. And this is about, I guess, 250, 300 miles from Philadelphia, where they had to stay for a year. They worked with counselors, they worked with other people with the idea of attempting to rehabilitate them. Now, the kids were awfully tough. I hate to say it, but the girls were actually tougher than the boys, more difficult to get along with. And they were extraordinarily disruptive. And despite the fact that they all came from the same background, all faced the same challenges, all were dealing with the same issues, they immediately hated each other. And there were fights, there were issues. I mean, you can only imagine what it was like to take care of these kids. We decided to take our group drumming protocol, Health Rhythms, and build a specific protocol for these kids, the adolescent kids, because they would not have tolerated the program that we basically developed. And we went ahead and we studied them. And it was challenging at first. It then became easier as we started developing relationships with these kids. And we did a comprehensive study. We were able to show that the group that participated in the recreational music making activity, okay, had major improvements in schoolwork role performance, total depression, anhedonia, negative affect, negative self-evaluation, and perhaps my favorite parameter, instrumental anger. And by the way, we did a comprehensive analysis on these kids based upon state regulatory documentation that we used for these kids. You may not have heard the term instrumental anger, but I'd like to differentiate it for a second. Anger is typically the feelings that one has in response to an occurrence or something that impacts them. Instrumental anger is the child or the adolescent is angry but doesn't express it, and then progressively builds up that anger inside until they finally explode. This is termed the Columbine effect. This is where the kid is picked on or ostracized or made to feel unworthy, goes through this for a long period of time, and then one day explodes, takes a gun to school, and you know the rest. But we were able to show statistically significant differences in instrumental anger. And we were able to do this through all the standardized evaluations that are used by the school system nationwide. What was kind of interesting is we learned a lot about the kids. Not surprisingly, the kids were fairly manipulative and they were somewhat difficult, at least to start with. I'm going to give you a couple of stories and give you a sense of what we did discover. The first story is 3 kids that basically came up to me and said, Dr. Bittman, I do think we can do rap music as part of this. And I said, well, you know, I don't know. I said, to be very straightforward, I said, I really have trouble connecting with that kind of music. I said, but I'll give you a shot. If you can write it down so I can understand. If you can leave out drugs, sex, and alcohol. And if you're willing to practice it and work together, I think I can improve it. They said, well, you know, the faculty over here said no. I said, I have a feeling they'll listen to me as part of this project. And 2 weeks later, they each had a written script for their rap. One was about a father that was no longer in the young man's life. Another one was the fact that he was being abusive to his girlfriend. And the third one is that he was not being fair to himself. And they basically read them and then performed them for me. And I looked at these kids and I said, you know, this is good, but it's not good enough. I said, if you really want to go somewhere with this, you really have to practice and you have to do it with heart. And they went back, and 2 weeks later, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. They performed it. They named their group Risky Business. And they basically went ahead and they wound up on television and radio and basically were able to tell their story and also perform. The second story I want to share from their research study was something that's truly unforgettable to me. It's a kid, a young man, who we've named Lionel. That's not his real name. And Lionel was very difficult. He was also bigger than the other kids, taller. And he was a bit frightening. The kids were afraid of him. And he would come into the drum sessions and grab the largest drum and just bang away at it without any connection to the rest of the group. He was phenomenally disruptive. And this went on for 5 sessions until the facilitator said to one of the kids, after listening to Lionel bang away, he said, what are you hearing in Lionel's drumming? And of course, Lionel gave the facilitator permission to ask the other kid. And the kid said, he's running away. And Lionel stopped dead in his tracks. And he said, Lionel, is this what you're experiencing? And he never responded. Absolutely never responded. But he got feedback from the group on how he was acting. It was really interesting. In the next session, which was the last session, he was not overpowering. He was not banging on the drum. He actually gave the largest drum to somebody else. And he was extraordinarily cooperative. Well, you'd think the story would end there, but it was actually, I think, 6 months later that the young man returned to school in Philadelphia. The principal of the school, high school, called my facilitator, the woman who had actually done this, and she said, and he said, "What did you do with Lionel this past year?" And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, he was in detention all the time. We called the police a number of times. He's been in school for 3 months now. He's a B+ student, hasn't missed a day, has not been tardy, is actually helping out other kids, and he has a spot on the basketball team." And the facilitator, whose name was Margaret, turned around and explained what we were doing with the kids. "Well, I want you to know he played basketball for Penn State and graduated and is doing very well today." So we're talking about measuring changes across groups, across research studies, but on an individual basis, I have countless stories of transformation for people who have experienced extraordinary challenges, who have basically either come out of their shells or turned their lives around through music. This is the final study I'm going to hit on today. It's a study that was actually published within a month of COVID-19 coming to the surface. The issue is mortality associated with cardiovascular disease in African Americans. And frankly, it's off the wall. In fact, I'm doing a presentation next week in California looking at inequities in healthcare. And the data for African Americans in terms of hypertension and cardiovascular disease are, astounding. So much higher than other groups. And what had happened was I was the Chief Population Health Officer for Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield's Allegheny Health Network in Pittsburgh when a church came to me. And they said, "We got a grant from a major company to do a study where we could provide cardiovascular education for members of our congregation." We assigned coaches within the congregation, but within 3 months, everybody dropped out. And they said, "We kind of know that you know something about music. Maybe that's something that we could somehow integrate with this, plus your position with the health plan might be beneficial." So what we basically did is develop a protocol. We looked at 71 African Americans, 35 in the intervention group, 35 in the control group. We basically assigned them to one or of two groups. The one group was sort of the group that did the cardiovascular education. It was a self-help course on diet, nutrition, exercise, stress reduction, and its impact on heart disease. And the second group did exactly the same thing, except they also participated in weekly gospel music sessions. So if you look over here, the control groups did the education, the experimental groups did the educational program, the very same one, but we had gospel music sessions. And it was kind of fascinating for us because we had never used these kinds of interventions as a catalyst for other outcomes. It was always looking at the direct effect of what we were doing. And the study was actually fairly tedious because anybody can lose weight or change in some ways within a period of 4 to 6 weeks, but we decided to do it over the course of an entire year. So the program went on for a year in Pittsburgh. And what we were able to do is see tremendous improvements in retention and completion rates for the individuals that participated in the music, along with the cardiovascular education. And what we were able to do is quantify the difference in sessions attended and the likelihood to complete the intervention based upon adding this element. Of course, we also looked at blood pressure and other cardiovascular elements, and we were able to show statistically significant improvements for the experimental group compared to the control group. So there was bona fide scientific evidence to show that adding a creative musical expression strategy to a cardiovascular disease prevention series of classes augmented or improved the impact that we were able to see. And when you looked at the impact on hypertension, I didn't want to get technical today, but that persisted 6 months after the study as well. A lot of people have said to me, why'd you do this? And the answer is pretty simple. We realize that those mortality rates are extraordinarily high, but we also realize that African Americans typically don't show up as a group to clinics or classes or wellness centers, and that they have a tremendous amount of faith or belief in their pastors, who often guide them throughout the course of their life. And by taking our medical intervention into the church and combining it with a spiritually oriented music approach that included singing, guitar playing, keyboards, and drums, we were able to augment the participation and the efficacy of those endeavors. So that's our last study that was published in 2022. And today we're working on a project with multiple school systems across the country. We're in the midst of that project right now. And we're looking at whether or not mentoring of at-risk handicapped kids, mentoring them in school orchestras can make a difference in their outcomes. So we're not talking about orchestras set up for the handicapped, we're talking about the typical school orchestra or band, integrating these kids into it with two primary outcome measures. The first is, have we changed those kids in the context of their ability to participate in activities like this and their quality of life? And the second thing that we're looking at is, how did the student mentors fare by spending a year with these handicapped kids? How did they develop as leaders during this program? And perhaps at some point in the future, you'll invite me back and I can tell you about that stuff.
Yes.
So in conclusion, okay, these are the pillars of transformation. These are the things that I believe that are really most important today. First thing I learned is that music gets through where words don't pass. Not everyone can contribute something or express something. A lot of us keep things bottled up inside because words don't do it justice. And bottling that stuff up inside has been shown through hundreds of research papers to produce negative biological impact. Two, from all these studies, I believe we're absolutely hardwired for music. Doesn't mean we all respond to the same music, but there's a direct connection to our psychology, our biology, and our genomic expression through music. The third is that creative musical expression leads to measurable genomic expression. We did that in a study that was limited to 46 genes and another one that looked at the entire human genome. We believe that group music making reduces the impact of stress on many levels and allows healing to begin. And we've seen that with elderly people, we've seen it with children, we've seen it with individuals facing the challenges of heart disease, of cancer, of other types of diseases. but it can certainly serve as a worthy catalyst for bringing people together, getting people to express themselves and to benefit from that expression. And finally, and I kind of think that from a societal perspective, this last one is most important. I believe that group music making is a catalyst for resolving our differences and for personal transformation. The world at this point seems to be in a very bad state. There are lots of conflicts that really should not be occurring. And maybe if we could sit people down and get them to make music together, maybe we could bring a sense of peace to some very desperate people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bittman, for that fascinating, detailed journey that you've taken, and the findings that seem so hopeful, so encouraging. I want to remind folks who are watching on YouTube, please use the chat session if you have any questions for Dr. Bittman or any observations you'd like to bring up. So we have time now for discussion, and Robert will be carrying the microphone around. If you have a question here in the audience, raise your hand, and Robert will come to you, and that way everyone can hear. And Robert, do you want to go over to?
Well, I just want to ask
Yes.
something first to follow up on what Dr. Bittman said.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that before Congress, before each session of Congress, they need a drum circle or something like that.
Yeah.
Have you tried introducing that to Congress?
Can you repeat that? I'm having trouble hearing you.
The idea is the U.S. Congress, Senate, and the House, what if they had a drum circle before each session? Would that help them?
I'm still not getting the whole thing. I'm sorry.
Robert is wondering, wouldn't it be a good idea to, for joint sessions of Congress, the House and the Senate, to have drum circles before their sessions? Could that enhance communication?
It could if they didn't kill each other with the sticks.
Well, couldn't they be hand drums?
Of course.
I don't know if this
Okay.
works, but
I don't either, so try it.
this way, this way.
Now, is
Yeah,
he
just-
hearing
just
this
stop.
microphone? He seems to be having trouble.
Can you hear me? Hold it closer. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Oh, and that one is for the group to hear. Is that right? Okay, so I'll repeat the questions if need be. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just wondering if there's been any studies done with this type of work with autistic children.
The question is about autistic children and music therapy or drum circles. Has there been any research or any practice in that?
Yeah, actually, there's been quite a bit. Autism, as you probably know, is a spectrum. So no two kids are exactly alike. Some kids do extraordinarily well. Other kids can't handle it. We see savants who are autistic, who are able to play musical instruments. That's not terribly unusual, but I don't like to generalize. There are multiple challenges in working with a group of autistic children, given those differences. And frankly, despite some information that's in the literature, on the other end of the spectrum, I've not been able to show any lasting improvements for individuals with dementia. So that can be extraordinarily difficult research, but there are certain kids that respond very well, and I think you have to look at it on an individualistic basis.
Could you please clarify your studies all dealt with making music. But what about just listening to music? Can you say something, some results on that side?
So the question is regarding what would be the difference in the studies between making music and listening to music?
Well, that's kind of where we started in the first group drumming study, listening to the music versus participating. The problem that I have with listening to music, especially in this era, when you try to perform investigational studies, is that I think we've all become adept at tuning everything out. Anybody that's been married for 10 years knows how to tune things out. So the question that I really have is, while the music is playing, are you still worried about your taxes? Are you thinking about something else? Are you worried about the conflict at work or the project that's not done? I think it's very difficult to do research where you can guarantee that that person's focus is music listening. I truly believe that as we started to walk through this field, or I should probably say crawl through this field, that it was so much better to focus on people that were fully engaged through making music rather than people who were in the room, quote unquote, listening.
It seems to me that your findings have something to do with the whole neuromuscular area. What strikes me is, we live in an era of the screen, and it seems like more and more passivity on the part of young people growing up. Anything that would get...
Yeah, undoubtedly. And we've done a lot of work in school systems. In fact, health rhythms is used in school systems across the nation. But I've actually worked with teachers who have offered a 10-minute drumming session prior to taking an exam. Or rather than disciplining a class in what may appear to be a negative way, bringing the kids together to drum. And I really believe that the in-ring support, camaraderie, creative musical expression, and communication, where music brings the group together and certainly impacts the person or the group on many levels. I hope that answers the question.
And it seems to me I was listening to one of your videos, and there was the issue about when you ask people who have self-identified as non-musical or they've been labeled non-musical, they can be extremely anxious about suddenly performing or trying to make music in public, and therefore that offsets any benefits. And what about people who go home and they're not performing for any audience, but they're just beginning to explore the guitar, explore the piano, or explore simple drumming? Would that have...
Intuitively, I think that has value, although that's not what we've studied.
Yeah.
But I really believe that learning to play a musical instrument is a positive thing. On the other hand, if we take it to an extreme, it's more difficult getting into a symphony orchestra today than it is getting into the NFL. And I've taken care of multiple musicians, I can't name them, who have come to the point of not being able to touch an instrument or come near to an instrument based upon the symptomatology that they develop based on that pressure.
Yeah.
So my feeling is, if the outcome of music lessons is perfection, I hate to say it, but I was pretty much a smart-ass kid. So when my music teacher basically stopped me and said, Mozart didn't play it this way, my answer was, how the hell do you know? And being a neurologist and having a research focus and neuroscience focus in behavior, I would have suspected, based upon what we know of Mozart, that he probably couldn't play the same thing the same way twice.
Yes.
So if the pursuit of perfection is what you're after, that's associated with a tremendous degree of stress and distress in professional musicians. However, if you're doing it to want to be in the band or want to feel part of something or to get together with your friends and do something that's fun and interesting, I think it's great. But, you know, the old saying, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? The answer is practice, practice, practice. And I want you to know that many professional musicians have a very difficult life.
Yes. Yeah. That's, and yes, what you were speaking about this afternoon to us. One thing that came home again and again to me is it's enhancing a sense of belonging. It's by participating in a group. And years ago, I knew a local drapery installer who'd grown up in Kentucky. And one time he told me, he was a friend of mine, and he said, when we grew up, everybody sang, everybody danced, or he said hoofed, and everyone played an instrument. And so there was a whole sense that, like this whole, and I imagine that's true in folk traditions, music is owned by everyone. And it's the peculiarity of this age we live in with mass media, that we have pushed the musicians off onto a stage. We're separate from them, and then all of us are intimidated by those examples of extraordinary excellence, and we lose the whole participation thing, and therefore we lose the whole sense of belonging.
Yes, you hit a great point. The sense of worthiness is really important.
Oh.
And I can tell you our culture has changed in the last 50 years substantially. When I was a child and we got together over the holidays, people sang and they made music, whether it was grandpa on a fiddle or grandma singing or whatever. And it was a way of not only coming together, but also sharing the family's history. Mm. Today, when people get together for the holidays, everybody's on their iPad. Mm. They're not talking to each other. I go to restaurants and sometimes look around, and everybody has a tablet or a phone out. I don't think we're communicating very well. But I sort of think back to the evolution of civilization, and I've spoken about this extensively. I think civilization evolved around the campfire. And personally, I believe that starting out by taking a rock and banging it on a stick created something that people could participate in without feeling threatened. When you consider what it takes, again, to get into a symphony orchestra, it's often devastating for people. However, when you put people together who have very little in common, they have different interests, come from different walks of life, and you give them an opportunity to play the drum, it can make a huge difference. But let me share a story with you, and this is one of my favorites. We ran at our hospital. We ran a cancer program for a number of years, and as part of the cancer program, we would certainly do counseling and other interventions. But once for every session, not for a long period of time, but during each session, we did some group drumming based upon the Health Rhythms program. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. The people came and they drummed, and these were people who had cancer, who were facing immense challenges. But there was one guy that stood out. He was a Pittsburgh attorney. He wore a three-piece suit. He had the gold watch. And he sat there with his arms folded, really not engaging the whole time. And the third session, he came to me, knocked on the door of my office, which was adjacent to this part of the hospital. And he said, Dr. Bittman, he said, I love what you're doing for my wife. We drive an hour and a half every week to come up here. But don't you think this drumming is a little hokey? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, this is new age craziness. And I said to him, I respect your opinion, but what we're really trying to do is giving people an outlet to express themselves and to feel part of a group that's non-threatening and supportive. And I said to him, I appreciate the fact that you're bringing your wife up here each week. I know that's not easy, but I'm going to ask you a favor. You have 2 more sessions with us. Could you come in and loosen your tie and sit down just for your wife and actually participate? Could you actually drum? Let it happen, try not to judge, whatever. And I didn't know if he would do it. I figured the worst thing in the world was that he could sue me for what we were doing, but he didn't. In the next 2 sessions, he came in and, true to his word, he actually drummed with the group, and he participated, and he even looked at times like he was enjoying it. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. It was 3 days before Christmas, and I get a call. It's this attorney, and the program had ended a month before. And my secretary passes the call over to me, and he gets on. He said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "How could I forget?" And he says, "I want you to know we have 14 grandchildren, and we're celebrating Christmas together at our home this year." And he said, "What do you think I brought them?" I have no idea. Out of the blue. He said, "I brought them each a drum. We're going to spend our time as a family drumming together."
Wow.
To me, that may seem like a breakthrough for drumming, but it was actually a breakthrough for his relationship with his wife and children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
So I could probably go on for the next 6 hours and share wonderful stories with you, but I've seen that sense of transformation of the human spirit through joining together and making music.
Well, I think credit goes to you for the way that you navigated that situation to get somebody who was so defended to open up, to generate that little bit of willingness that,
Well, I'll tell you, I've been very fortunate. I think there are more children of physicians that get music lessons than any other group. Over the course of the last decade, I've had this extraordinary opportunity, typically a couple of times a year, to do a program called Physician Musician with Drew Tredick and Mike Garson, who's a phenomenal jazz fusionist, pianist, and basically get up there and give them a very quick summary of the impact of music. And then we get them to experience it. But not experience it as a regular concert, but being able to understand what's going on, be able to talk to the audience, be able to respond to their needs. And Mike actually composes on stage based upon the feedback that we're getting from the audience. And I can tell you personally, I've been a musician throughout my entire life, but when I listen to Drew or Mike play, it truly changes my biology. There's no question about it. So maybe in a selfish way, I keep on doing this because it has such a profound effect personally.
And you were talking about, in answer to one of the other questions, about listening to music, and that it's a hard thing to measure because we don't know what the person is doing with their attention, since that's something invisible to us. And supposedly, if somebody was attending to the music, it would have effects that are very different than if their mind was drifting onto something else. I guess that brings up the question: is it possible that, independent of the power of attention, that because certainly the eardrums are working and there are some neural signals going to the subconscious mind, that there could be something happening? And I'm reminded about years ago there was buzz about the Mozart effect and playing certain CDs for babies. Do you think there's anything to all that?
Well, I did the keynote for the Mozart Festival in Vienna, and there were a lot of neuroscientists that were talking about the firing of certain areas of the thalamus, of the temporal lobes, the cortical regions, and so on. However, the question that I have as a neurologist is that we have billions and billions of billions of neurons, and just looking at patterns of EEG activity or whatever, even though we can sync up to the music, doesn't mean it's translating into anything positive. I have no doubt that listening to music for some people can be very effective. However, I really believe that the key here is creative musical expression, of being able to participate. I think we all have a need to be respected, to be loved, to be part of the band.
Right.
And I think that when we give people that opportunity, it's not subtle, it's majorly transformative.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story about a drum circle facilitator that I learned about years ago. I actually did a film on this impact. And I was speaking to this young man who was highly charismatic. He was a facilitator who did multiple groups. And he was with a community-based group, and there was no focus other than a drum circle. But there was a woman in the back of the room who just kept on pounding and pounding and pounding on the drum, completely separate from the actual beat and the actual rhythm that was occurring for the group. And she stood out like a sore thumb. She was an elderly woman. And this young man walked up to her at the end, and he said, "I saw you during the drum circle. I'm sorry that we couldn't connect better. I wish you would have enjoyed it or resonated with us." And she looked at him and she said, "Sonny, you don't have a frigging idea what you're talking about." He said, "My husband died 4 years ago. This is the first time I've been out of the house in 4 years." She said, "This has been the best time of my life."
Wow.
So when it comes to psychology, when it comes to trying to figure out what people are thinking and what they're experiencing, it's very difficult to read people.
And I'm reminded what you said about what people will have difficulty saying with words. They will speak with a drum skin.
Yeah, and frankly, it's not just drumming. We've seen that with creative writing, with people who maintain diaries. But there's a great deal of literature about people that keep these feelings and experiences pent up inside until they literally destroy that person. And, you know, my feeling is there's a part of this circle, the health rhythm circle, that's called inspirational beats. The press has called it percussion discussion. But basically, we ask a question that's appropriate for that group, and we ask them to play their answer on the drum. Just play what they feel. And we use that as the catalyst for discussion. And perhaps I should bring this up right now because this is really important. There are a lot of art forms that generate creative expression. And if the end point is that creative expression, in my opinion, it falls short. So the person that gets frustrated and, you know, paints away and puts a wonderful painting together, and you look at it and you say, oh, this person was troubled or they were incarcerated or whatever, that expression is okay. But full circle is giving that person an opportunity after they've expressed themselves this way to then verbalize it. And we've incorporated that into our work. So it's not just a matter of banging away at the drum, but it's a matter of saying to that person, would you like to share with the group what you just communicated? And sometimes they say no. And our next question is, would it be all right if I asked somebody in the group to tell us what they heard? And if the person says yes, that person comes in and says, I heard courage, I heard frustration, I heard resolution. And then suddenly you see tears coming down the person's face, who basically express themselves in a way that they didn't have the courage to do verbally. And then, I hate to say it, but it's sort of like magic. Then they start talking, and they start expressing themselves. I've even used it on a corporate level, where you take a department of highly effective people that can't work together. We see it all the time. I see it in healthcare constantly. We're taught to compete. We're not taught to collaborate. In schools, collaboration is called cheating.
Yeah.
But you put them together and you give them an opportunity to say something, and they're afraid to say anything. So we would take departments that were having challenges or problems in the hospital. We'd give them a drum facilitator, and they drum for 45 minutes, 6 weeks in a row. And 9 times out of 10, they were able to resolve their problems.
And
The
would
beauty
you,
of the
yeah, would you
Sure.
give them, I'm curious, at what point would you do the exercise of asking questions and having somebody answer on the drum? Would you incorporate that in these corporate groups as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When was the last time you felt that you were at the end of your rope in your job? When was the last time you felt good about what one of your coworkers did? How do you express yourself when you feel that what you're being asked to do is unfair because the person sitting next to you is dropping the ball? So the questions are contextual for the challenge that the people are facing. So I guess there's a little rudimentary psychotherapy in there to get people to talk about, how do you feel about this new merger? I mean, it's those kinds of things. But doing it in context is absolutely extraordinary.
That's amazing. And
We had, in fact, go ahead. I learned this from one of the kids in the adolescent program. Most of the kids from Philadelphia were really tough. There was one kid in the group who was under 5 foot, really scrawny, and didn't fit in. And he didn't get a lot of respect from anyone. And we were in a circle, we were asking the kids to express something that they hadn't shared before. And one of the girls said that she was raped by a family member. And with that, 2 other girls stepped up and said, that happened to us as well. And they started crying in the circle. And again, our goal is sort of to let the participants work these issues out, help each other, and find common ground together. And they hugged each other. And this little kid, who really hadn't fit into anything before, basically said to them, he said in front of the entire group, he said, you're good people. You didn't deserve that. It's not your fault. Now that sounds like a profound statement for somebody who's really not connected to the group, but the overall impact of saying that changed his dynamic with the group, and the group embraced him. And I'll tell you one more story, and then I'll take another question. I know we're getting to the end, but that group, the Risky Business group that we put together, those 3 African-American kids, they were absolutely fabulous. And we had just done a television show. We did a recording CD with them. And my wife and I and the facilitator decided to take them out for dinner. So we went over to the home, we got permission to take these kids out, and they had never ordered in a sit-down restaurant in their lives. And they were just absolutely overwhelmed with the choices, and you can have whatever you want, you can have dessert. They had never, ever experienced it. And at the end, I said to them, I was wondering if you could help me. I said, your group was extremely disruptive in the beginning. You gave our facilitator, her name was Margaret, you gave her a rough time. And over the course of several weeks, you guys came around and we saw a marvelous improvement. We started a new group 2 months ago, and it's the most cooperative group we've ever seen. And I doubt that we're going to see any real change in that group. I said, do you have any idea what's going on? And they looked at me and they said, yep, we did it. I said, what do you mean we did it? He said, when the new group of kids comes over in September, we sit down with them and we explain what they have to do to survive here. And we told them, if anybody gave Miss Margaret a problem, that they would be dead. I'm not suggesting that this is the outcome, but putting together that group, giving them a sense of value, a sense of importance, a sense of appreciation,
Right.
very much probably the way the tribes were established
Yeah,
in the past. That sense of belonging
that's right.
created even for these kids a sense of protection for the drum circle facilitator. So,
Belonging,
that's all.
ownership, responsibility, absolutely.
and
Question?
Karen,
Yes, Carol.
Dr. Bittman, I want to say thank you for for illuminating a lot of the things that I feel and have felt since I was a little girl singing in choirs. And the same emotions, the same companionship, the same quality of work, all of the things that you're talking about, I relate to as being somebody who's been in choirs since elementary school. Do you draw any parallels between musicianship and singing?
yeah, I could hear that. Yeah, I think there are lots of parallels. I think that our educational system is not doing very well today. I think that we isolate kids, we don't teach them to work together. We don't focus on creating a culture that is positive in our children. We focus on teaching subjects rather than kids. And I can tell you in situations where we've been able to introduce these strategies into classes that were having a really rough time, the kids' performance improved. And it's not the Mozart effect where music makes you smarter. It's that the kids could relax, settle in, drop some of the barriers that they had to dealing with the teacher or education, and just feel better inside. And I think that improves overall academic performance. I hope that helps.
Beautiful.
Is rock and roll music dangerous?
Oh, yeah.
Like most of the players that play rock and roll tend into losing their hearing. They're driven into using drugs, into smoking, drinking a lot of alcohol. So the type of music is driving them to do that, or some other aspect of their personalities.
Dr. Bittman, could you?
Could you-
Yeah.
Could you explain that? Because I couldn't hear.
No problem at all. The questioner is asking, is rock and roll music dangerous? We find rock and rollers losing their hearing, getting into drugs, drinking, etc. Is that because of the kind of music it is, the kind of culture? What do you think about that?
I think that may be part of it, but I think it's different for each person. The pianist who I have the greatest respect for on the planet, Mike Garson, was the pianist for a major group. And the group used drugs. I mean, he was David Bowie's pianist. And they did all sorts of things, but he never succumbed. He didn't do it. So I think the choice that people make is what really counts. What I'm really against is lyrics that incite people, that are written to basically create a sense of anger or frustration and generate those kinds of thinking. I guess I'm not fully supportive of freedom of speech. I think that if you go out and say something that's going to denigrate another human being, I don't think that should be permitted. And if you're inciting a group of people to do something illegal or harmful, I'm certainly not for it. I don't like to make generalizations, but I can tell you that drug addiction and abuse and abnormal psychology permeates all different forms of music. So I'm not going to tell you that uniformly one type of music is good and another type of music is bad. And I also don't believe that there's one note or one tone or one rhythm that's going to change everybody's biology. I get that. I get asked that all the time. I don't think that there is just one piece of music that has that impact on us. So I do not believe in the Mozart effect.
Okay, and let's see.
So this is a question from Mr. Alan Cooley on the internet. Thinking of music as a form of communication and community, are there attitudes of managers, teachers, parents, which would make the group experience a more positive one?
Are there attitudes of teachers, parents that can make a group experience more effective?
Yes.
Yeah, to be very frank with you, I get to do a lot of presentations, and years ago, I was lecturing to the nation's largest music teacher organization. They had a couple of thousand music teachers there. And I did the keynote, and I, just basically asked the audience, what's a home run as a music teacher? And first comment I got was, our kid makes it to a symphony orchestra, or they win this competition, or they get to play at a major concert hall or go to Europe. Those are all home runs. And I looked at the group and I said, I'm very sorry for all of you. Because if that's what you value in music, you've completely missed the boat. The greatest achievements in music are the transformations of the human spirit. Are the people who, without music, would have taken their own lives.
Yeah.
It's the inspiration that comes from feeling part of something that changes that person's quality of life in a way that nothing else could. So if it's about winning the competition or playing in Carnegie Hall, I don't buy it, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Bittman. We have a message from Drew, which is wonderful. He says, please ask him how the medical community is employing his research, the programs that are embracing the research to help patients, and what your vision is of the future of healthcare.
The first one's easy, the second one's hard. Frankly, I've never had a physician walk out on a presentation back then. I think inherently physicians recognize the value of music. I think what our research has done is it's created empiric evidence that it works. And whether you're a physician or a healthcare administrator or the CEO of a health plan, an insurer, I think that having that evidence goes a long way to establishing the credibility that you need to be able to use it. So I think we've spent the last 2.5 decades creating that credibility. But I've never had any resistance. I've never had a physician get up and walk out of a presentation. And I've never been challenged on the value of music. And what we're seeing today is more and more hospitals and medical institutions are using music as a therapeutic endeavor for many patients, especially individuals with chronic conditions or children facing life-death circumstances. So we're seeing a tremendous growth in this. We're also seeing the use of music in psychology and counseling and support groups, not only throughout our nation, but throughout the world. My vision of healthcare for the future, and you guys have to know that I spend most of my time in healthcare, not in music, is that we have a long way to go. We have to figure out how to work together. We have supply chain mismatches. I know the California system very well because I work there, but we have shortages of physicians and nurses and staff. I think we have to come up with ways to be more humanistic. We have to use what I call the Robin Hood effect, meaning we rob from the rich to feed the poor, meaning that everybody doesn't need the same level of care. There are people who don't need a physical examination every year, who don't need X test every year, and there are others that need far more than what the health plans are willing to pay. So I think we have to find those patients who are most needy. We have to address those needs. We have to restore a sense of equity, meaning that outcomes improve across all socioeconomic groups and ethnic groups, and that we can look at a system that we'd be proud to pass down to our children and grandchildren. So that's what I work on every day. Thank you, Drew.
Okay.
Yeah, this is to answer the questions somebody asked whether physicians and doctors employ this kind of healing, maybe. And actually, my daughter is psychiatrist, and she is a faculty of University of Virginia. She majored in medical biological ethics for a long time. She taught there for over 20 years, and now she thinks she have want to change and learn how to using art like dancing or creative, and she had written a Karen Bridge article last week. It says that immersion in creativity and artistic expression of all sorts can bring us closer to our humanity. She's now actually doing research and trying to use art, dancing or creative art, pottery, to help patients recovering. So to answer the question they asked, there are doctors doing this, and she's grouping with other dancers and trying to do this.
That's lovely, thank you. I don't know if, did you hear that, Dr. Bittman?
I heard most of it. I heard most of it. I didn't get a question, but just a comment. I think
Yep.
More and more academic medical centers are developing music and creative arts programs to do precisely that. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Again, I believe society evolved around a campfire with people making music. I think that's what brought us together in the first place. And I kind of think, given all the ills that we're facing in society today, it might be a great way to bring us back together.
Beautiful.
Wow. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Bittman. It's really a big surprise to me, because I didn't think that this afternoon we would be pursuing, focus so much on the 10th aim of the Institute of World Culture, which is to promote universal brotherhood and to foster human fellowship. Because through the studies that you've done, the really extraordinary thing to me is how music can bring people together. You know, how strongly it releases people's feelings and their ability to communicate and empathize with each other. And like you say, this has to be done in a non-competitive setting, so to speak. That it really makes a difference how you set things up. The other amazing thing to me about your presentation was how you were undaunted by the lack of results.
Yeah.
What do we get? Nothing. What do we get? Nothing, but persevered, you know, looking, because you knew there was something, you know, to continue the research and find out what actually was going on. So it just seems like such a valuable area of study. And I was serious. I mean, from what you've said, you know, to me, like Congress should, you know, get together in a drum circle with a facilitator and learn to work together. You know, it sounds to me like there's real possibility. Now, that's probably not going to happen. But so again, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you. I want to share just a couple more things. In November of 2011, 2001 rather, 911, I was basically asked to present to the United Nations. And what moved me to do so was Associated Press International looked at the Afghani kids after the American troops stepped into the region. and I'll never forget this as long as I live. What I noticed in the pictures is that kids were drumming in the streets. They had hand drums in the streets. And one of the people I know who was a diplomat in that area basically said, you know, Dr. Bittman, I can tell when a country is on the mend or whether they're in trouble before I even talk to anybody. And I said, really, how? He said, when I get into an airport, if there's music, I know the country's in the mend. If there's no music, the country is certainly in trouble. I'm going to leave you with one last thing. And this is a true to life story. It's a class that actually occurred at Princeton University, and it's a final exam. And the professor asks one of the students to pass out the exams. Student comes up to the front desk, grabs the test, passes them out, goes to the last seat in the back of the room, opens up the exam booklet, and raises his hand. And he says, Professor Einstein, there's a problem here. And Einstein says, yeah. He said, these are the exact same questions you gave us for our midterm. And Einstein says, yeah. The questions are the same, but the answers are different today.
Very good.
With that, thank you for allowing me to participate. I wish you the best, and I want to thank you for sharing this message and helping people in need.
Well,
Thank you, Doctor.
Music to my ears.
It's been a wonderful afternoon. Just want to remind members of the Institute and whoever's interested that our next program is Tuesday evening on the 14th, May 14th at 7:30. We'll be doing a Zoom program on transformative education, the art of living and learning, where we'll be hearing from teachers in India in their classroom. So, part of world culture. Thanks again.
Thank you again, Dr. Bittman. Keep up the wonderful work.
Yeah, yeah.
Great evening.